Praise. He bought a house for $1 and discovered 3 towering women in the kitchen. John Miller had never imagined that buying a house could be so exciting and so strange. He had grown up in a small town, always dreaming of having a place to call his own. For years, he had saved every penny he could, working part-time jobs during college, helping neighbors with odd chores, and even tutoring kids in math to earn a little extra. When he graduated, he had enough money for a modest down payment, but houses in the city were far too expensive for someone like him. It seemed like owning a home was a dream that would always stay just out of reach. One rainy afternoon, as John was scrolling through the local town's online bulletin board, something caught his eye. It was an announcement for a property auction. But not just any property. This one listed a house for only $1. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. How could anyone sell a house for $1? Was it a scam? Maybe the house was haunted. Or maybe it was falling apart and the town just wanted to get rid of it. Curiosity, however, has a way of taking over caution. The more he read the description, the more intrigued he became. The auction was happening in a few days, in a small town about 2 hours away, and the house was described as charming but in need of care. The next morning, John packed his bag, took his car, and drove toward the town. Rain drizzled lightly against the windshield, giving the journey a calm and almost mysterious feel. When he arrived, he saw the small building where the auction was being held. A few other people were milling around, mostly older folks who seemed to know each other. Their conversations faded when John asked about the $1 house.
"Oh, that one," an elderly man said with a grin. "It's been sitting there for years. Needs a lot of work.
But if you're lucky, it's yours for $1. John listened carefully, trying to imagine it. Could he really own a house for just $1? He knew there would be costs for repairs, taxes, and maybe surprises. But the idea of owning his own place, even if it needed work, was thrilling. When the auction began, people started bidding on other properties. Some went for a few $100s, some for several thousand, and John quietly waited for his turn. When the auctioneer finally called out the $1 house, John raised his hand. "Do I hear $2? Someone joked, but no one actually bid. After a few moments of silence, the auctioneer nodded, and John was told he had won. Just like that, in a matter of minutes, the house was his. As he drove to the property, John's mind raced. He imagined walking through the rooms, arranging furniture, painting the walls, and making the house truly his own. When he finally turned onto the street where the house stood, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The house was older than he expected, but its paint was chipped, the roof sagged slightly, and the yard had tall grass and weeds, but there was something about it that felt warm and inviting. The windows, though dusty, reflected the soft afternoon light in a way that made the house feel alive. John parked his car and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked slightly under his weight, but they seemed solid enough. Desk. He took a deep breath, feeling the scent of wet earth and old wood. It was quiet, too quiet almost. He wondered if anyone still lived there. The door was unlocked, just as the auction notice had said. When he pushed it open, a rush of air from inside greeted him. The house smelled of old furniture, spices, and something else he couldn't quite identify. It was faint, but it reminded him of kitchens where families gathered for big meals. John walked slowly through the hallway, noticing details he had not expected. The walls were covered in the faded wallpaper, and the wooden floor had scratches and dents that told stories of years gone by. There were photographs on a shelf, old and yellowed, showing people he did not know. He wondered who had lived here before. The house seemed to whisper its history, and John felt both excitement and a little unease. What kind of life had happened within these walls? As he reached the kitchen, John paused. The room was larger than he imagined. with high ceilings and wide windows that let in soft light. It was empty, or so he thought. A faint sound of movement made him freeze. At first he told himself it was the wind, or perhaps a branch tapping the window. But then he heard laughter. Light, warm laughter. He looked around, confused. The kitchen was empty, or it appeared so. John called out softly, "Hello?" There was no answer, just the echo of his voice bouncing off the walls. He stepped further inside, his curiosity overcoming caution. That's when he noticed it. Shadows moving behind the counter. And then, from behind the large kitchen table, 3 tall women appeared. They looked like statues at first, so imposing was their presence. But their faces were kind, and their eyes curious. John froze, unsure what to do. Bess. I just bought this house, he said slowly, trying to explain himself. The women exchanged glances and smiled. One of them, the eldest, stepped forward. "We know," she said calmly. "We've been living here." "We didn't expect anyone new so soon."
John swallowed hard. He had not expected to meet anyone in the house, least of all 3 people who seemed so confident and sure of their space.
Yet there was something reassuring about them, something that made him lower his shoulders and try to smile. I
don't want to disturb you," he said. "I just bought the house, and I wanted to see it."
Psst. The women laughed softly, a sound that filled the kitchen like sunlight through the windows. "You're not disturbing us," said the middle one, who looked younger and more energetic. "This house has been waiting for someone to care for it. We can help you if you want." John felt a strange mixture of relief and curiosity. He had imagined challenges, repairs, and loneliness in this house, but he had not imagined meeting these 3 women. Who were they? How long had they been living here? Why had no one mentioned them at the auction? Questions raced through his mind, but he also felt a strange sense of comfort. Perhaps this unusual beginning was exactly what he needed. For the rest of that afternoon, John wandered through the house with the women by his side. They pointed out spots that needed fixing, shared memories of the rooms, and even offered him tea from an old kettle. The kitchen, he realized, was more than just a room. It was the center of life here, a place full of stories and laughter. The $1 house suddenly felt like something much more valuable than he had ever imagined. As evening fell, John stepped outside for a moment to look at the yard. The rain had stopped, and a soft golden light touched the walls of the house. He felt a mix of pride and wonder. He had bought a house for $1, yes, but he had also stumbled into a world of stories, of people, and of history he never expected. And deep down he knew that this was only the beginning. The real story of this house, and of the 3 towering women in the kitchen, was just about to start. John couldn't stop thinking about the house after that first afternoon. Even as he drove home, the image of the 3 women in the kitchen stayed with him. Their height, their confident presence, and the warm smiles that seemed to welcome him despite his surprise. Every bump on the road seemed to echo with possibilities, and he realized he had no idea what kind of lives these women had led inside his $1 house. That evening he sat at his small apartment, staring at his laptop, trying to find more information about the property. But the usual public records were vague. It was as if the house and its inhabitants existed in a quiet bubble separate from the rest of the town. The next morning, John packed a small bag with tools, a notebook, and some sandwiches, determined to return to the house. He had many questions, but more than that, he felt a strange pull to see the women again. When he arrived, the house looked different in the morning light. The rain from the previous day had washed the walls and the garden, making everything look brighter and almost welcoming. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch. Before he could reach the door, he heard voices coming from inside. It was lighter than the day before, full of energy and laughter. John knocked gently. The door opened, and there they were, the three towering women, standing side by side as if they had been expecting him. Martha, the eldest, gave him a nod and a small smile. Lila, the middle sister, waved energetically, her eyes sparkling. Sophie, the youngest, peeked from behind the counter, shy but curious. "Good morning," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I thought I'd come back and see the house again." Dasp. Maybe I could help with some chores or cleaning."
Martha's smile grew warmer.
"We were hoping you would come. The house is a bit messy, and your help will be appreciated." "It's easier when more hands are here." John stepped inside and noticed how naturally the women moved through the space.
They had clearly been living there for a long time. The kitchen was lively, filled with the aroma of herbs and spices.
Lila was carrying a basket of fresh vegetables, placing them carefully on the counter, while Sophie arranged a few jars of ingredients that looked like they had been in the house for years. Martha was already kneading dough, preparing to bake bread. John watched quietly for a moment. He wasn't sure how to start a conversation, but the warmth in the room made it easier.
"It smells amazing in here," he said.
"Did you bake that?"
"Yes," Martha said with a chuckle. "We've been baking bread and small pastries for years."
"It's our little tradition. Would you like to help?" John hesitated for a moment, then nodded. But he had never been very skilled in the kitchen, but he thought it would be a good way to learn more about the women and the house. Martha guided him carefully, showing him how to knead the dough. Lila offered tips about chopping vegetables safely, while Sophie quietly observed, occasionally pointing out small details he might miss. As they worked, the conversation began to flow naturally. John learned that Martha had been the caretaker of the house for decades. She was organized, practical, and had a gentle authority that seemed to guide the others. Lila was energetic, outgoing, and loved teaching dance classes in the nearby community center. Sophie, on the other hand, was quiet and thoughtful, with a talent for painting and creating art. The three women had lived together for years, forming a bond that was almost unbreakable, and John could see why. They shared responsibilities, supported one another, and filled the house with laughter. "You must be wondering why we've been living here," Martha said as she placed the bread dough in a bowl to rise. "We were asked to stay by the previous owner." Britt. "He trusted us to take care of the house, and we've been here ever since." "I see. I didn't expect anyone to be living here." Inspiration, especially not three women. He felt a little embarrassed for thinking it. Lila laughed. "People usually think the house is empty, but we've been here. We like it this way. Peaceful, private, and full of memories." Sophie added softly, "It's a good place to create, to cook, to be ourselves. That's why we stayed." John listened carefully, feeling a growing sense of respect for them. He realized that the house was more than just walls and rooms. It was a home in the truest sense, a place where people lived fully, shared responsibilities, and built something meaningful. As the morning passed, John learned more about the routines of the house. The women moved seamlessly through their tasks. Martha managed the kitchen and baking. Lila handled chores and organization, and Sophie created art and took care of smaller details. Despite their different personalities, they worked together effortlessly, like a well-rehearsed team. John tried to help where he could, sweeping floors, arranging furniture, and even attempting to knead some dough, which ended in a messy but fun moment that made everyone laugh. By lunchtime, John felt more comfortable. He sat at the kitchen table while Martha served freshly baked bread and soup. The women encouraged him to eat generously, and the warmth of the room made him feel like he had found a place where he truly belonged, even if only temporarily. Over the next few days, John continued visiting the house. He learned small details about each woman. Martha had a sharp memory and loved telling stories about the town and the house's history. Lila had a playful sense of humor and loved teaching John little dance steps as a joke, making him laugh until his cheeks hurt. Sophie, initially shy, gradually opened up, showing John some of her paintings and teaching him how to appreciate small artistic details. One afternoon, as John was cleaning the living room, he asked, "Do you ever think about leaving the house?" Martha shook her head. "Not really. This house is part of who we are. We take care of it, and it takes care of us. Leaving would feel wrong."
Lila nodded.
"It's our safe place. We've seen many changes in the town, but this house stays the same for us. And now, it seems you are part of it too." John felt a mix of emotions. He had bought the house for $1, expecting perhaps an empty building, a project to fix. Instead, he had discovered life, history, and people who had made the house a home.
He began to see his role not just as an owner but as a participant in this shared space, someone who could learn from the women and contribute to the life they had built.
As the days turned into weeks, John's bond with the women grew stronger. He began keeping notes in his notebook about repairs, ideas for decoration, and even recipes Martha shared. The kitchen became the heart of their interactions, a place where stories were told, meals were shared, and laughter filled the air. One rainy evening, as they all sat around the kitchen table drinking tea, John asked,
"Have you ever had anyone else live here?"
Someone like me? Martha smiled softly. Not really.
People pass through the town, but most never notice this house. Those who do usually just see an old building.
They don't see the life inside, Sophie added. It's not about being noticed.
Bad.
It's about living fully in the space we have and sharing it with people who respect it. That's why we feel comfortable with you.
Bringing. John felt a warm sense of belonging. He realized that owning a house was more than just having a property. It was about being part of the life that existed within it, about understanding the stories of those who came before him and contributing to the story as it continued. The women taught him more than practical skills. They taught him patience, care, and the importance of community. He learned how to tend the garden, how to cook simple meals, and even how to organize small spaces efficiently. But more than that, he learned about trust and friendship. The women, towering as they were in presence and wisdom, became guides in a life he had never expected to lead. By the end of the month, John felt that the house was no longer just a house. It was a living entity filled with warmth, stories, and laughter. He had walked into it as a stranger who bought a property for $1, but he now felt like part of a family he had never known he needed. And yet, despite all he had learned and all the connections he had formed, John knew that there were more surprises to come. The house had already shown him that appearances could be deceiving, and that life often held mysteries that were both strange and wonderful.
As he left the house one evening, looking back at the kitchen window where the women waved goodbye, John felt a sense of gratitude.
He had bought a house for almost nothing, yet he had gained something far more valuable. A glimpse into lives fully lived, a connection to people who trusted him, and the beginning of a story that was richer than anything he could have imagined. First, John felt more comfortable in the house with each passing day, but adjusting to the routines of the 3 women was not as easy as he expected. He had imagined that owning a house meant freedom, painting walls, arranging furniture, and deciding everything on his own, but he quickly realized that this house was already alive, full of established rhythms and unspoken rules. Every corner of the kitchen, every shelf in the pantry, and every room in the house seemed to belong to someone. Martha, with her calm authority, oversaw most of the household tasks. She had a system for everything, from the way the vegetables were stored to how the laundry was folded. Lila moved with energy, constantly tidying and improving spaces, her laughter filling the hallways even when John was tired. Sophie preferred quieter tasks. She painted, organized books, or tended small indoor plants. John quickly understood that any effort to reorganize or improve something without asking first could lead to confusion, or worse, upset someone. The first week, John tried to find his place, round in desperation. He helped sweep the floors, clean the windows, and carry in groceries. But he made mistakes, like stacking dishes in a way that Martha didn't approve, or accidentally leaving muddy shoes in the hallway. Each time, he felt embarrassed, but the women handled it with patience. Martha would gently correct him, saying, "We all have our ways here."
You'll get used to it. Lila would laugh and show him the correct way, making it feel less like a scolding.
Breaths. Sophie, quiet as ever, would smile and nod, silently encouraging him to keep trying. One afternoon, John decided to try cooking something for everyone. He wanted to show that he could contribute beyond cleaning and carrying things.
He had little experience, but he thought, how hard could it be?
He decided to make a simple vegetable soup. As he chopped carrots and onions, he realized it was trickier than he thought. Lila peeked over his shoulder, giggling. "Here, try this grip. It's safer." John adjusted his hands, grateful for the guidance. Soon Martha joined, offering tips about seasoning and timing, while Sophie suggested adding a few herbs for extra flavor. By the end of an hour, the soup was ready, and it actually tasted good. Sitting together at the kitchen table, eating and sharing stories of their pasts, John felt a sense of accomplishment. He was no longer just a visitor. He was participating, contributing to the life of the house.
Evenings became one of John's favorite times.
The three women had a ritual of sitting together after dinner, sometimes knitting, sometimes telling stories, and sometimes simply sipping tea in comfortable silence. John began to understand the depth of their bond. They weren't just roommates. They were family, in the way that only years of shared experiences can create. Martha often spoke of the old days when she and the previous owner had worked together to maintain the house. Lila shared stories from her dance classes, often exaggerating for comedic effect. Sophie, more reserved, shared little anecdotes from her painting projects, showing John the care and thought behind each piece of art.
Despite the warmth and laughter, living with the three women also presented small challenges for John. The house had rules that weren't written anywhere but were clear to anyone who lived there.
Shoes had to be left by the door, dishes washed immediately, and certain areas of the house were private. John respected these rules, but he occasionally forgot, leaving a cup in the living room or moving something without asking. Each time he felt a pang of guilt. However, the women never made him feel unwelcome. Instead, they gently reminded him, and over time he began to internalize their routines, blending his habits with theirs. One rainy afternoon, John found himself alone in the garden, trying to pull weeds and trim the overgrown bushes. The rain had made the soil soft and muddy, and he slipped a few times, getting dirt on his clothes. Lila came out to help, laughing as she guided him. "You have to hold the shears like this," she said, showing him the correct technique. Martha soon joined, bringing hot tea in a thermos to keep them warm. Even Sophie stepped outside, carefully planting new flowers in a small patch near the fence. Together, they worked for hours, and by the end, the garden looked transformed. John realized that chores, when shared, could be both productive and joyful.
Living together also revealed small but meaningful details about the women Defiles.
John noticed that Martha often woke up earlier than the rest of them. quietly preparing breakfast and organizing the day. Lila, full of energy, had a tendency to talk faster when she was excited, sometimes bouncing ideas around the kitchen like a whirlwind. Sophie had a habit of humming softly while painting or tending plants, a quiet melody that somehow made the house feel more peaceful. Observing these habits, John began to appreciate not just their presence, but the personalities that shaped the life of the house. One evening, while John was attempting to fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen, Martha leaned against the counter watching him work. "You're learning quickly," she said, smiling. "But don't worry if it's not perfect. This house has seen worse, and it will survive a few mistakes."
John laughed nervously. "I just don't want to break anything."
"I already feel like I'm stepping into someone else's world."
Martha's eyes softened. "We knew that at first."
"But the house grows with the people who care for it. You're becoming part of it, in your own way." The days passed, and John began to feel a rhythm in his life with the women. He helped with cooking, cleaning, gardening, and even small repairs. They shared stories, laughed at minor mishaps, and celebrated small victories, like when the bread came out perfectly, or when a stubborn stain on the floor finally disappeared.
Over time, John began to see subtle ways the women had shaped the house.
Martha had a special cupboard where she kept recipes handwritten on faded paper, some decades old. Leela had rearranged a corner of the living room into a small dance space, complete with mirrors she had salvaged from an old studio. Sophie had decorated the walls with tiny, colorful murals, each telling a small story of the house's history or the town's life. John realized that their presence had made the house not just livable, but vibrant. Despite growing comfort, John also faced moments of doubt. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever truly belong.
The women had shared the house for so long and their routines were deeply ingrained. Would he always feel like an outsider?
Yet each time he expressed a concern, the women reassured him with patience. "Everyone takes time to adjust," Martha would say.
"But your effort matters more than perfection." One Saturday morning, John suggested they all work together to clean the attic. It was a dusty, cluttered space filled with old furniture, forgotten belongings, and cobwebs. The task seemed overwhelming at first, but as they worked together it became an adventure. They laughed as they uncovered old photographs, letters, and trinkets. Leela found a box of costumes from a school play decades ago, and Sophie insisted they display a few of the old props in the living room. Martha smiled quietly, observing how John was not just participating but learning to appreciate the history of the house. As they worked, John realized something important. The house was not just a building, and the women were not just caretakers. The house and its occupants were a living ecosystem, each person contributing to its life. His role was to respect, learn, and add his own energy to the space. It was a lesson in humility and patience, but also in joy and collaboration. Evenings were often the best time. After a long day of chores, they would sit together in the kitchen, sharing stories and tea. Sometimes the conversation drifted to memories of the past, sometimes to dreams for the future. John began to understand that the women's laughter, guidance, and shared routines were more valuable than any repair he could make to the house. One night, as they were finishing dinner, Lila turned to John. "Do you feel at home yet?" she asked, her voice playful but sincere. John paused, thinking about the past weeks. He thought of the mornings sweeping the floors, afternoons in the garden, evenings sharing tea and stories, and the laughter that had filled every room. He realized that the feeling of home wasn't about ownership, walls, or furniture. It was about connection, trust, and shared life. "Yes," he said finally. "I think I do." "Thanks to all of you." Martha smiled, and Sophie nodded. Lila clapped her hands together. "Good. We were hoping you'd say that. From that day, John felt a new sense of belonging. He was not just a man who had bought a house for $1. He was part of a household, a living, breathing home filled with stories, personalities, and laughter. He began to take initiative more confidently, suggesting small improvements, helping with meal planning, and even planning little surprises for the women. Through small successes and occasional mistakes, John learned a vital lesson. A house is not a home until it has life, care, and shared experiences.
And in this house, with these 3 towering women, life was abundant, vibrant, and full of warmth.
As the days turned into weeks, John understood that the journey of living together was only beginning. There would be challenges, disagreements, and moments of doubt, but there would also be laughter, learning, and bonds that could last a lifetime. By the time the last week of autumn rolled around, John felt like the house had become a part of him, and he had become a part of the house. The long days of adjusting, learning, and sharing life with Martha, Lila, and Sophie had transformed him in ways he had never anticipated. The $1 he had spent on the property now seemed almost meaningless compared to the experiences and connections he had gained. Yet, as comfortable as he had become, John also sensed that the house still had more stories to tell. Secrets it had kept, lessons it wanted to teach, and bonds it wanted to strengthen. One chilly morning, John woke early and decided to explore the small attic more thoroughly. In the past, he had only visited briefly, helping the women move boxes and dust shelves. Now, with a growing sense of confidence, he felt ready to look more closely at the items stored there. The attic smelled of old wood, paper, and faint traces of lavender. Sunlight filtered through the small window, illuminating stacks of boxes, old furniture, and forgotten belongings. As John carefully moved a pile of boxes, he noticed a small chest tucked in the corner. It was old, the hinges rusty, but surprisingly intact. Curiosity piqued. He pulled it closer and opened it. Inside, he found a collection of letters, photographs, and journals, all neatly tied with ribbons. The handwriting was elegant and precise, a window into lives long past, prodigious. He realized these were the possessions of the previous owner, perhaps left as a time capsule for anyone who cared enough to discover them. Excited, John carefully brought the chest down to the kitchen, where the women were preparing breakfast. "Look what I found in the attic," he said, placing the chest on the table. Martha's eyes widened. Breaths. "Oh, that chest. We've seen it, but we were always too busy to go through it properly." "You found it!" Lila leaned over, her curiosity shining in her eyes, and Sophie carefully untied the ribbons to examine the contents. As they began reading the letters and looking at the photographs, the kitchen became alive with stories from decades ago. The letters were full of daily life, celebrations, small disappointments, and triumphs. The photographs showed children playing in the garden, family gatherings in the living room, and moments that seemed frozen in time. John realized that the house had been more than a shelter. It had been a witness to joy, struggle, and love. For hours, they read through the chest together, piecing together the history of the house and its previous occupants. Martha shared her memories of the previous owner, recalling stories of how he had built parts of the house with his own hands and tended the garden with care. Lila laughed as she found a photograph of the previous owner attempting a dance routine in the living room, much like the ones she taught her students. Sophie quietly traced her fingers over the old letters, reading aloud passages that captured moments of hope, friendship, and laughter. John felt a profound sense of connection. He had always thought of the house as a starting point for his life, but now he realized it was a bridge linking the past and present. The chest revealed that he was not just inheriting walls and furniture. He was inheriting a story, a life lived fully, and a responsibility to care for it and continue it. Days passed, and John became more confident in his role within the household. He was no longer just a helper. He was a contributor, a companion, and a friend. He learned how to bake bread perfectly under Martha's guidance, dance along with Lila's playful steps, and even create small pieces of art inspired by Sophie's murals. Each day brought new lessons, and each evening ended with laughter, shared meals, and stories that connected them all more deeply. One afternoon, a small challenge arose that tested their growing bond. A heavy storm had passed through the town, and the backyard was flooded in places. The garden, which they had tended so carefully, was damaged. John felt a pang of worry, fearing the women might be upset. But instead of scolding him, Martha suggested they work together to restore the garden. Lila grabbed shovels, Sophie gathered seeds and plants, and John did his best to help wherever he could. As they worked side by side in the mud and rain-soaked soil, John realized something important. Living together wasn't just about following routines or sharing chores. It was about facing challenges together. The storm had threatened the house, but it also strengthened their bond. By the time they finished, the garden looked even more beautiful than before, a testament to teamwork, patience, and shared effort. That evening, after cleaning up and drying off, they gathered in the kitchen for a warm meal. The storm outside had left the house feeling cozier than ever. John watched the women moving naturally through the space. The way Martha organized the counter, the way Lila hummed a tune while preparing tea, and the way Sophie arranged flowers in a small vase. He realized that this house, once empty and neglected, had become a living home filled with love, care, and shared memories. As winter approached, the days grew shorter and colder, but the warmth inside the house never wavered. John found comfort in the routines they had built, waking up early to prepare breakfast, tending the garden, cooking together, and sharing stories at night. He learned that home was not just a place, it was the people who filled it with life, the moments they shared, and the trust they had in one another. One particularly quiet evening, John sat with Sophie by the fireplace. She was sketching a new mural for the living room, and he watched her hands move gracefully across the paper.
"You've really made this place feel like home," he said softly.
Desperates. Sophie smiled, a gentle warmth in her eyes.
We didn't think anyone could fit in so easily.
But you've become part of it.
We're glad you're here. Martha joined them with a tray of cookies, and Lila brought over hot cocoa.
They sat together, sharing stories from the chest they had discovered, laughing at old photographs, and planning small projects for the coming months. John felt a deep sense of belonging, realizing that the house had given him far more than he had ever expected. It had given him friendship, lessons in life, and a place where he truly belonged. In the following weeks, John began to contribute in more meaningful ways. He repaired broken shelves, painted parts of the living room, and even helped Sophie set up an art display for the local community.
Each small accomplishment was celebrated with laughter and appreciation, and John realized that the joy of living here was not in grand gestures but in daily acts of care and shared effort. The women, too, learned from John.
He introduced small improvements, shared ideas for organizing spaces more efficiently, and brought new energy to the house. Martha appreciated his practical approach, Lila loved his playful humor, and Sophie admired his growing attention to detail. But together, they created a rhythm that blended experience with new perspectives, making the house even more alive than before. As spring approached, the house looked transformed. The garden bloomed with vibrant flowers, the kitchen was filled with fresh herbs, and the walls reflected the combined creativity of all four of them. John had learned to bake, cook, garden, and repair, but more importantly, he had learned the value of patience, trust, and shared life. One sunny morning, as they sat on the porch drinking tea, John looked around at the three women, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. I never imagined buying a house for $1 would lead to this, he said. I thought I'd get an empty building. Instead, I found family. Martha reached over and patted his hand. A house is never just walls and furniture. It's the people who fill it with life. And now you're part of ours. You better believe it. And you better keep helping with the baking, or we might have to recruit someone else. Sophie smiled quietly. Oh.
You've become part of our story, John. And that story is still growing. John realized she was right.
The house had stories from the past, stories they had created together, and stories yet to come. It was no longer just a building he had purchased for $1. It was a living, breathing home, full of warmth, memories, and love. Looking out at the garden, watching the sunlight dance across the flowers and the windows, John felt a deep sense of peace. He understood that some of the most valuable things in life could not be bought with money. They were found in connection, care, and shared experience. The $1 house had given him more than ownership. It had given him life lessons, friendships, and a sense of belonging he had never known he needed. That evening, as they all sat together in the kitchen for dinner, laughter and conversation flowing freely, John realized that he had truly come home. The house, once empty and mysterious, had become a place where he could grow, learn, and belong. The 3 towering women in the kitchen had taught him that home is more than a place. It is the people, the stories, and the shared moments that fill it with life. And as he cleaned up the dishes that night, John smiled to himself. The house he had bought for $1 had given him far more than he could have imagined. A home, friendship, and a story that would continue for many years to come.